And I'm Amelia.
And we're the co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co, a modern sewing kit company. Today, we're sewing our wrap dress. To make this project, we'll be learning and practicing 4 main skills: creating a beautifully finished garment with a lined bodice and French seam skirt, sewing darts to create shaping, using bias binding to finish raw edges and make straps and ties, and hemming on a curve.
So let's jump in.
The kit comes with everything you'll need to complete the project. Access to step-by-step illustrated instructions corresponding to the steps in this video, fabric yardage custom printed with the textile print you chose and the pattern piece templates, and a notions kit with a preloaded bobbin and matching thread, sewing pins, a printed seam gauge, a bias binding maker, hand sewing needles, a seam ripper just in case, and the most useful tool of all time, this hemming tool. There are 3 additional tools you'll need to complete the project. You'll need a sewing machine, an iron, and scissors. I'm going to explain a little bit about the style. The wrap dress has an A-line skirt with a fully lined bodice that is finished with bias binding, which also becomes the straps and the long wrap ties. Before we jump in, I'll give you a little overview of how that all comes together. I'll start by sewing the 3 skirt panels together with beautifully finished French seams. Then I'll sew the bodice portion, starting with both bust darts and then attaching the bodice front and the bodice back at the side seam. The lining and the exterior are the same shape, so once those pieces are all sewn together and sandwiched back to back, it'll create a cleanly finished lined bodice. Next, I'll attach the skirt and the bodice. Then I'll make a really long piece of bias binding and edge the sloped back with this continuous piece of bias that will then become the shoulder straps, and then edge the front panel and then become the long ties. From here, we'll hem the circle skirt, and with a twirl, we'll be finished. So I'll start with a few notes about our Paperless Patterns system. The textile print extends all the way to the cut line of the pattern pieces, and the pattern pieces are designed with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. So just to be clear, the seams are the lines of stitching that hold the pieces together, and the seam allowance is the extra space between the stitch line and the edge of the fabric that will end up on the inside of the piece. Because the textile print extends past that stitch line into the seam allowance, even if you don't stitch everything perfectly straight, you'll never see a gap or any unprinted fabric. The fabric is also printed directly with notches, so there's no need to clip them in order to mark them. Now, notches are the small marks perpendicular to the cut edge that act as guides while you're sewing. For this project, notches help match up corresponding pieces, show how the darts are sewn, and help make it the gap in the bodice where the pull strap is going to come through. You may notice a piece with a printed border that says extra fabric, not a pattern piece. For certain sizes and styles, we had a small extra blank space when we laid out the pattern pieces, so in those cases, we filled them with a little extra printed fabric. We won't use these for this project, but we hope they find their way into a future creative endeavor of yours. So, with the pattern templates printed directly on the fabric, I'm just going to go ahead and cut out the pieces around the lines. So I've cut out the pattern pieces, and I just want to briefly identify who's in this colorful pile. The largest arcing piece here is the skirt back. Then these 2 slightly smaller asymmetrical arc pieces are the front skirt pieces. Then we have the bodice pieces. For each exterior bodice piece, there's a corresponding lining piece in a solid color. This piece with the dip in the back is the bodice back, and then these wedge-shaped pieces that mirror each other are the right and left side of the bodice. So that's the whole body of the dress. And then we have these bias strips. So we have 2 short pieces that will edge the underarm, and then these 3 epically long ones that will actually be sewn together to make a really long piece that is attached at the center back and concludes all the way at the tip of the ties. So we're going to be diving into the sewing steps. So if you're brand new to using a sewing machine, check out our Sewing 101 video. We go over all the basics there. Because this skirt is unlined, all of the construction seams for this part will be French seams, which result in beautiful finished edges on the inside. A French seam is essentially a seam where the seam allowance, which is traditionally exposed and on the inside, gets encased in a second row of stitching, so the raw fraying cut edge is no longer exposed. It's a really simple, clever stitch that's great for unlined garments. The main thing to be aware of with a French seam is that you start by setting up the pieces with the right sides facing out. This is easy to go on autopilot and start with the wrong sides together, which is how you position the pieces in a simple seam. So you just have to be careful. I'll start by attaching the front and back panels together at the side seams. The skirt front panels are mirror images of each other, and each side extends from the side seam across the center front to the dart under the opposite side where it'll wrap. So if you look at the waist arc of the piece, you'll see a notch on one edge. This is indicating the side seam allowance. The next notch indicates the quarter mark that will line up with the dart on the bodice. The third notch on the piece is the center line. The grain of fabric, which is the woven grid of fabric, is oriented vertically on the straight of grain at this center line. Then beyond that notch, the skirt piece extends, creating an overlapping wrap and that edge will be finished and hang straight. So we'll match the front pieces to the back piece, wrong sides together, lining up the side seam and making sure that there are the seam allowance notches on these front panels and on the side of the back piece that you're lining up. So I'm finding the notches that indicate the side seams. And I have my front panel here and then my back panel notch. I'm lining those up, and remember the right sides are on the outside. So I'm just going to pin down this whole side seam. And when I do this, because this cut edge is on the bias, it's not on the straight of grain, it's a lot stretchier than if the cut edge were straight up and down across that grid of the fabric. So you can really manipulate it intensely. So I always will pin the top of the seam and then pin the bottom of the seam. Just because if I pin kind of from the top all the way to bottom, I can sort of push these pieces and then they might not line up at the bottom. For the purpose of the demo, I'm just going to be doing one side through this whole process. And feel free to do whatever's comfortable for you, either doing each step on either side of the skirt or taking one seam all the way through the process and then repeating it on the other side. So with the seam allowances for this project, they're a 1/2 inch, but because we're using French seams on these seams, which are made up of 2 rows of stitching, for the first row, we'll use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then later, when we do the second row, also at a 1/4 inch, the collective seam allowance will equal a 1/2 inch. So I'll stitch this side seam at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And on my machine, there's a little divot on the foot that marks this 1/4 inch seam allowance. That might be indicated slightly differently on your machine. So just be sure to measure and see where a 1/4 inch lines up with your machine. So I will start this side seam. I'm just stitching down, simple stitch, 1/4 inch, and I'll back stitch at the top and the bottom. So now I have that side seam sewn, and I'm just going to trim the seam allowance back to an 1/8 inch and then press it flat. So I finished my side seam with a back stitch, and now I have this 1/4 inch seam all the way down the skirt side seam, and I'm gonna trim this back to an 1/8 of an inch and then press it flat. And trimming this gets rid of the sort of frayed edges that have gotten frayed since we cut out the pieces, and just make sure that it's very even, and when we do our second row of stitching, it'll be pretty important that we trimmed this back to an 1/8 of an inch. So, and trimming it back an 1/8 of an inch is basically just trimming it down by half. So that's an easy thing to visualize. Now I'm going to press this flat, and then I'm going to open up the seam and press it open from there. So I'm opening the garment flat, and the seam is sticking straight up. And now I'm going to press it so that the seam we just sewed is pressed open and flat. And I'll do this by using the iron as an anchor on one side of the fabric, and then using my hand to sort of gently pull the two pieces apart. And this is sort of opening that seam up, and I'm using the iron to push the seam allowance over to one side. And at this point, it doesn't matter which side you push the seam allowance over to. And then I can look at this from the other side. And you can see that it's really nice and open and flat on this side. So from here, we're going to fold the garment at the seam so that the right sides are now together. So the right sides are facing each other, and then we're looking at the wrong sides. And I'm folding this to set up for my next row of stitching, and just want to fold down the seam line we just made so that the seam line itself is at the very edge of the fold. And then I'll press that and pin that into place, and then I'll take it back to the machine and stitch that second line of 1/4 inch stitching. So my side seam is folded out, the right sides are together, the wrong sides are facing me, and I have the side seam pressed and pinned, and then I'll take this back to the machine and sew another 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when I sew this second line of stitching, it will actually encase the seam allowance that we trimmed down inside a channel. And this is why it's important to trim the edge down to 1/8 so that it doesn't catch in the new line of stitching and poke out of the seam to the outside of the garment. So I'll use that divot in my foot to mark this up again. You'll also see that that seam allowance notch is where this line of stitching should originate. So you can see through the fabric to that notch. So once this is sewn, I'll press the seam open and flat and press the seam allowances towards the back panel of the piece. If you've never sewn a French seam before, this is the most satisfying thing. It's just so easy and so cleanly finished. So I'll press it towards the back from this side, and then when I flip it over, it'll look just clean and beautiful on the front side. Great, so we have one of the side seams of the skirt sewn, and I'm going to repeat the same seaming step on the other side, and then I will have my skirt sewn together. The skirt is sewn together at the side seams, but these front panels, which will overlap when the dress is wrapped, are still raw edges. So I'm going to finish those by turning the raw edge under twice and top stitching it. You can absolutely do this by hand using an iron to press the double fold, but we included a hemming tool in your kit to help with hemming the curved edge of the skirt. So because you have this magic tool, you might as well go ahead and use it with this raw edge, because it'll help finish this as well. So I cannot stress enough how amazing this tool is. I frequently listed it as one of my top 10 most valuable possessions when I acquired a piece in college. So basically, this ribbon is made up of a rigid grid-like structure with an open frayed edge on one side. I'm going to line up the edge with the raw edge of my fabric and make a line of stitching through these little teeth, connecting it to the fabric below. Basically, this ribbon is made up of a rigid grid structure with little open frayed edge on one side. So to make the rolled edge, you line up the frayed edge with the cut edge of your fabric on the right side of the fabric, and then make a line of stitching through that little teeth, connecting it to the fabric below. The important part of this row of stitching is that I don't ever cross over into the grid-like structure on the left. I also want to make sure that I maintain a consistent distance from the cut edge with my row of stitching. And this line of stitching won't show up in the final hem, but it is dictating the width of the hem fold. The line of stitching holds this tool in place for the time being so that it can help us with the next step. Because the stitches are just over the open teeth, when I'm finished, I'll be able to slide the tool right out of the hemmed edge. It's literally brilliant, and I promise it makes a lot more sense once you do it. So I'm going to take this to the machine and do that first line of stitching right over the teeth, about 3/16 of an inch from the cut hem. So I've done the first row of stitching, connecting the tool to the right side of the fabric on the front panel. Now I'm going to roll this tool over the edge, and this folds the fabric over tightly and neatly along my stitching line. So being pretty gentle with it, because like I said, those teeth, this isn't like attached on here permanently, but I can roll it over and you can see that the stitch line is making that nice edge. And then I'm actually going to roll it over again, and now you can see we basically have a double fold, and this rolled edge is encasing the raw edge inside of it, and my my hemming tool is tucked up right next to that edge and is holding it into place. And the little teeth of the tool they're dictating the depth of that rolled hem. So I will fold this over and kind of like gently just position it, and then I'll take it back to the machine, and I'm going to stitch from the edge where I see the roll so that I can stitch right along this folded edge. So I'll bring that back to the machine and position this right under my needle, and then I kind of use the hemming tool to like press up against the edge so that that fold is its smallest width and is as tight as possible. this tool is also helping stabilize the seam, so I'm not stretching the seam as I'm stitching it. It's really amazing. So now, with this line of stitching done, the folded edge is sewn and secured, and here's the magical part. I'm just going to gently slide the turning tool out of the hem. Slide the hemming tool. And the teeth just slide right out of that line of stitching, and we end up with this amazing, perfect rolled hem that we didn't even have to use an iron-on once. It's really great. So gently sliding that out, and we'll use the hemming tool for everything later, and we have our perfect hem. And then I will give this a press just to flatten it out. Then I'll repeat that on the other front panel edge and move on to the bodice. So the skirt is sewn, and we can put this aside for the moment and focus on the bodice. We have two sets of these pieces. One's in solid, that's the lining, and the other's in a print, and that's the exterior of the dress. So you'll be following the exact same series of steps with each set, and I'm going to work on the front side. So just a quick note about the bodice pieces. They're cut out on the bias, which is when you intentionally orient the piece at a 45-degree angle to the straight of grain. This gives the shape more flexibility than if it were cut with the woven structure oriented straight up and down. So if you picture a grid with threads going vertically and horizontally, which is what plain weave cotton is, then imagine pulling that structure from either direction, sideways or up and down. You'd be pulling those threads directly, and because those threads don't have stretch, that piece has no give or ease in those directions. In contrast, the 45-degree angle of the bias changes the orientation of the grid-like structure so that the vertical and horizontal threads are making an X. Now, when you pull on the fabric, either sideways or up and down, you aren't pulling directly on ends of individual threads. Instead, that pull is sort of warping that grid structure. And because of this, when you cut a piece on the bias, it has more stretch. And in this case, the bodice is able to sort of shape and form over the curves of the body more than it would if it were cut on the straight of grain. So I'm going to start on the exterior and then repeat the same steps with the lining pieces. And I'm going to start with the darts in the front piece. So a dart is a device that is used to create three-dimensionality in a flat piece. This is a classic technique in making tailored garments. And by pinching out this little wedge of fabric and then stitching down that edge, what we're doing is we are changing a flat piece into a piece with 3 dimensions. So in this project, the darts create shaping around the bust, and we're basically manipulating the front panel to taper in from the bust to the waist, which is narrower. So the pattern piece has a printed guide with 2 notches and then 1 line that ends in a little ball dart point. I'm going to, with right sides together, so I'm folding the right sides to face each other, make a crease on that dart line. So I can see it through the fabric, and I'm just going to crease it with my fingers. And I'll see that the notches that are on the waist seam here, those line up. And I'll pin that into place. So I'm pinning by the notches, and then I can see where the dart ends, and we're actually going to sew the dart a 1/2 inch past there. So if you want to use your printed seam gauge, you can use that to mark a pin, use a pin to mark that 1/2 inch past that dart line. The reason we don't have the notch all the way to the tip of the dart is if you sewed it at all incorrectly or like at all off, we don't want that like black dart notch to show. So I'm pinning the dart tip and I'm pinning the notches, and then I can bring this to the sewing machine and stitch from the cut edge down to the dart. Sewing with dart is pretty simple, but I just have a few notes. You're always going to start sewing the dart from the seam to the dart tip. And unlike every other stitch we make, you're not going to backstitch once you get to the dart tip. If you did, it can pull the fabric and it just can kind of look a little weird, and you want that area to be really like a soft area. So instead, we'll keep sewing off the edge of the fabric and then trim the threads long enough so that we can make a little hand knot to secure the threads, because we won't be backstitching. That being said, you can backstitch, and you definitely should, at the start of the dart. So there's no line that I'm following, but I'm just tapering that edge from where I start down the triangle edge to the dart tip that I've marked. And then I'm making my threads longer than normal. And then I'll just do a hand knot by going through the loop twice, holding that loop, and then pulling those threads. And then I can clip this off, and this will all be inside the lined garment, so you won't see any of this stitching. So I can clip this off just at a couple inches. So I've stitched this dart and tied it off, and now I'm going to press it over away from the center line. So the center line is this tapered triangle edge, and this straight edge is the side seam. So I'll take my iron and press that dart, and I'm pretty careful when I'm up towards the dart tip. You don't want to like make a really intense crease there. You just want to gently use the iron tip to press that dart over. And it helps the structure of the dart to keep that full wedge of fabric there. So we're just going to press it over, and the end will get sewn into the waist seam, and it will just lie flat in the inside of the garment. So now I'll repeat this dart process on the other front exterior piece as well as the two lining pieces. With the darts sewn, I'm now going to attach the front pieces to the back piece at the side seams. With the back piece, you'll notice that one side has a dotted line across one of the bottom corners. I'm going to find the bodice front piece that has the matching guide. And this guide notates where I'm going to leave a gap in the side seam so that the wrap tie can come from the inside to the outside of the bodice when I put the dress on. So I find that piece that matches in the front, and then I'm going to match those side seams together and pin that. And you'll match the notches at the bottom, and you can match the notches at the top. And it might look like the top doesn't line up because of the angle of the pieces, but you'll notice that where the notches overlap, that stitch line actually does line up really perfectly. So looks a little funny, but it's right. So now I'm going to sew this side seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to stop this right when I get to the notch and backstitch there. I'm not going to continue on over the edge. So I give it a nice back stitch right at that notch, and Then I'm going to press this seam flat and open with the iron. And if these seams feel like a little wiggly, it's because these pieces are cut on the bias. So instead of stitching on the straight of grain, you're stitching across the grain. So it can feel a little unstable. And where the seam isn't sewn at the bottom, I'll just press that seam allowance back as if it were sewn the 1/2 inch. So I have that pressed open and flat, but it's not sewn this last inch. Now I'll repeat the same pinning and sewing process on the other side, but this doesn't have that that dotted line. So when I pin it, I'll just be lining up the cut edge, and I'll be sewing a 1/2 inch all the way down that edge, going off on either side from the top and the bottom. Now once the entire exterior bodice piece is sewn together, I'm going to repeat the same process with the lining pieces, and I'll repeat the same side seam process where we left the bottom open and the full seam on that piece. At this stage, I have sewn my skirt piece, the bodice exterior, and the bodice lining. And now with just one line of stitching at the waist, I'll connect the skirt and the bodice as well as attach the lining to the inside of the bodice so that it's fully lined. To set this up, I'm going to start by laying out the lining piece with the right side facing up and the waist seam, which is the straight edge, at the top of my work surface. So I have the right sides, and then the waist seam is facing up, and that's like a nice curve. And next, I'll place my sewn skirt piece, also right sides up, lining up the waist seams. So I'll open this up. This is the waist seam, and then I'm putting this right side up and placing that over the lining piece. I'm going to sandwich this with the bodice exterior piece, but I like to pin these in 2 stages because it feels a little more manageable. So I'll start with pinning these 2 layers together. Now, there are many guides that will help us orient this pinning process. So first, I'll match the side seams, and I'll pin the right side here, just matching the side seam of the bodice piece and the side seam of the skirt. And I want to make sure that the seam allowances of the bodice are pressed open and flat, and the seam allowance of the skirt is going to be pressed towards the middle, which is the back. So line that up here and pin that into place. So I just pinned the right side, and the left side is a little bit different. The dress is entirely symmetrical except in this very one spot. Here is where we left a small opening on the side seam for the wrap strap to come from the inside to the outside of the garment so that we can tie it with the other strap when we put it on. I already left that space open when I stitched the side seam, but I need to pin it and sew it correctly here so that the seam allowance doesn't fold up and block that hole that we left once we bring the lining up to the bodice. So I'll start this by pinning the opening that we made here closed along the stitch line that we would have stitched. So that's you have like a nice crease there from when you pressed the seam allowances back. So just line up that crease and pin those together, and that will just mimic like a seam, and it'll help this next stage of pinning. So then with the back, with the skirt seam allowance pressed towards the back, we'll line up the seams, and we're just going to pin. When we pin this side, we'll push both seam allowances to the opposite side, and we'll pin the right. So I'm pinning the bodice and the skirt piece together, and then when I pin the left to the left of that seam, I'm pushing both of the seam allowances to the other side, and then I'll pin through those 2 layers. And what I have here is exactly what I had on the right side, except this seam is pinned and the seam allowance is free. And when we stitch this line, the waistline stitch, we'll stitch all the way up to that seam line on the skirt and back stitch, and then we'll stitch all the way from the other side. And the goal is that we'll leave this seam allowance free, whereas over here we're going to stitch directly across the seam allowance, so it'll be tacked down to the seam and it won't be free. And the free seam allowance will help us when we fold the bodice up and create that little gap where we can put the strap. So now we can move on to pinning with all of the other anchor points. After I've pinned the left side, I'll continue matching guides and seams. So I'll match the center back notch and pin there, and then I'll match the dart in the bodice here with this notch that's about 4 inches from the side seam. And when I pin that, I'll just pin it making sure that the dart is pressed towards the back. And then I'll match this next notch, that's indicating the center line, and pin that. And I'm just pinning these spots that have defined anchor points all the way around. So now I have my lining pinned to my skirt piece with those specific anchor spots, and now I can take the bodice exterior piece and lay that over the top, and I'm going to lay this over with right sides facing the right side of the skirt and the wrong side facing up. That way, once this seam is sewn, the waist seam, and this flips up, the entire dress will have that beautiful bright print on the outside. So I'm going to pin this in the exact same places as I pinned the lining, and I can just line it up and remove the pin that's already in place and put it through the 3rd layer. And I'll just do this in the exact same way. This piece mirrors the lining piece exactly, and just taking care to pin that left side with the same way, leaving the seam allowances free. So I've pinned through that stitch line, and now I'm pushing all the seam allowances over to one side and pinning, pushing all the seam allowances over to the other and pinning. Now once all those touchstone connections are lined up and pinned through the 3 layers, I can start to pin between them, lining up the cut edges. And I'll just put a couple of pins, because this seam is on the curve, it is a little bit flexible, so I do want to And because we're sewing through 3 layers, just want to maybe go a little heavy-handed on the pins to make sure everything lines up. And you will notice that the point of the front of the bodice piece extends past the finished edge of your skirt piece. And that looks a little funky, but it's okay. You're going to be stitching this at a 1/4 or a 1/2 inch, and that will kind of line this up here, and then you'll be finishing this edge. So eventually those pieces will line up. So now I can take this whole big sandwich to the machine and stitch along the entire waist seam at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm setting that up and I'm just going to start stitching, and then once we approach this, the left side where we left that opening, we'll take a little bit of a break. So as I reach the left side with the opening, I'm going to stitch to the side seam all the way up to where we have that side seam pinned, and then I'm going to back stitch. Then I'm going to lift my presser foot up and pushing all of the seam allowances, both on the top side and the bottom side, over underneath. I'm going to continue on that stitch from exactly the same point as where I stopped it, but just on the other side of the seam allowances. So I'm going to approach that, and when I approach it, I want all the seam allowances pushed towards me so that I don't catch any of them in the seam. And then once I stitch up to that point, then I can take my piece fully out, push all the seam allowances away from me, and start that seam again at the exact same point, just on the other side. And I'll back stitch here as well. And as you're continuing on along this waist seam, take extra care as you're sewing over the various seams and darts that the seam allowances stay flat and pressed in the direction that you want. It's really easy for the underside half of the seam allowance to kind of get caught by the feed dogs and be pushed the other direction. And that's definitely not the end of the world. You can either clip that out or remove that section and restitch it. But just to be aware of it as you're sewing, you can kind of double check where the seam allowances are right before you go under that section. And when you're aware of it, it usually mitigates the issue. With the waist seam sewn, flip the bodice lining up and press it flat. So you're just pressing that lining up from this side, and then we'll flip it over and we'll do it from the other side as well. So then we're flipping it over to the exterior side, and the lining should be pressed up, and then we're just taking the iron and kind of butting it up against that waist seam and pressing the seam flat from this side. Now we're going to finish that side seam gap. So open the piece up and find the skirt seam allowance that's sandwiched between the two bodice seam allowances. Clip into that seam allowance along the side seam right up to the waist seam. That clip separates the skirt seam allowance so that you can divide it when you fold it up. Then we're going to trim out the French seam excess and just kind of clean that up a little bit. And now on the exterior piece, we're going to fold the waist seam allowance up and then fold the side seam allowance back. Then we'll repeat the same technique on the lining side, except you'll also catch the skirt seam allowance. Now, when you fold up the lining and the bodice pieces, the gap we left in the side seam is open and clean. Make sure the gap in the lining and the bodice are lined up, and then in a moment we'll top stitch around this, but for now we can just pin it into place. The edges of the bodice pieces should line up nicely at the top. So to finish the bodice piece off, I'll match the seams of the edges and pin the bodice lining to the bodice exterior. And when I'm doing this, I just want to kind of press up from that waist seam and make sure that the fabric is flat, and then that the edges line up. So then I will pin these and match the side seams and match the shape of the pieces. So once this is pinned, I'll take this to the machine and I'll stitch along the edges of the pieces at 1/4 inch. This just ensures that the pieces are sandwiched and are stabilized for the next step. And then at this time, I'm also going to top stitch around the side gap at 1/8 inch. I've stitched all the way around the edge, and then I'm finding the gap I left open. So I'm finding the gap I left open, and I'm going to put that under the machine. And what we're doing is we're just going to be stitching 1/8 of an inch around this little hole just to hold it in place and hold those layers together. So we can start at the top and we'll stitch across 2 stitches. So starting at the top, we can actually pull these pins out of here once we're across. So I, with the hand wheel, stitch 2 stitches across that side seam line, and then I'm pivoting my piece 90 degrees, and then I'm going to stitch down this edge. And then stitch until I hit that seam line, put my needle down into the fabric, and I'll turn my piece 90 degrees again. It's okay, it's kind of bunched up here, but that's okay. With the hand wheel, I will stitch back across 2 stitches, and then I'm turning it one more time. Have to feed that whole skirt through there. So that I'm now facing to go back up and meet with those stitches I originally made. So I'm going back up the side here, and I hit that stitch, and I can do a little back stitch here. And now you can see this hole is open and cleanly finished, and all of those seam allowances that we were so careful to put on the inside of these side seam allowances are tucked neatly back there, and they're not, like, none of the fraying edges are exposed. So that's how we'll finish that side gap, and then when we put this on, the strap will come through there to the outside of the garment. So once the edges are sewn, you can trim off any frays or any jagged parts, like these little seam allowance triangles, trim those off. And you just want to get this edge as even as possible, but you're not taking off any significant quantity. You still want that to be at 1/4 of an inch. So now I can set this aside, and the next step of this process really brings the dress together. So I'm going to use a bias binding to finish the raw edges of the bodice, and I'll also use it to create the shoulder strap and the ties. Like I mentioned with the bodice pieces that are cut on the bias, by cutting these strips at a 45-degree angle on the fabric, they're a little stretchier and more flexible around the curves, which we'll see in a moment. The flexibility also means that it's a little more finicky to fold and press and maneuver. So we added a tool in the kit that helps with this process. To make this binding, I'll use the bias binding maker. And these come in different sizes, and they help press over the edges of the bias strip to create an even binding. So I'm going to start with these 2 short pieces that we'll use to bind the underarm, and then we can approach the longer pieces after. So I'll set those aside for the moment. So I'm going to thread the bias strip into the bias binding maker with the right side facing down to the table. So I'll start with one of the points, and I just thread it into the wider end of the bias maker. You can use a little pin to help kind of pull this through. There's an opening in the top. So I'll see the tip coming out here. I can just kind of pull that gently through. And now I'm going to use a pin to help anchor this starting point, and you can see basically the tool is forcing those sides over and folding them down. So I'm using pins to anchor that in place, and then I'm slowly going to drag this tool across my piece of bias, and then I'm following it directly with a hot iron, and the tool is forcing the edges to fold over in like an even, controlled way, and then the iron is pressing that directly into place. So just gently along, and I can look, see it's beautifully pressed and into this nice even strip. And the short beats are actually a little bit harder because you can sometimes take a minute to sort of get into the rhythm of this. So when we approach the longer piece, it's actually kind of nice to do a piece that long. But I'll just slowly follow my tool with my iron all the way across. And you can see here I have this really nice, neatly pressed strip that is 7/8 of an inch wide and has this folded edges on one side, and it's flat and even on the other side. So I will make both sides of this, but I'll show you the whole process with this one. So I'm going to use this piece of bias we just made to edge the underarm portion of the bodice. So we are going to edge that first, because then we'll use that long piece of bias that we're going to make to edge the scooping back, and then that'll extend past the edge of the garment and go over the shoulder to become the spaghetti strap, and then it'll connect back to the garment, edging the front, and then it'll extend off of that to become the tie strap. But we want to do the edging for the underarm first, so that that second piece of bias can cleanly finish every raw edge that remains. So to use bias binding, what we're basically doing is we're going to be lining up the raw edge of the bias binding with the raw edge of the garment, and then we're going to pin that into place and stitch in this crease here. It's a 3/8 inch. We'll stitch along that crease, and we'll be connecting that piece of bias to the front side of the garment. And then once that's connected, we'll be able to fold it over the edge, and it'll create a beautiful finished edge by kind of encasing that raw edge within this piece of binding. So I will start by lining that up on the raw edge and pinning. And this is why this is on the bias, so that we can kind of ease this around the curve. If we'd cut this piece on the straight of grain, it would be kind of bunching and really not following this curve smoothly. And this piece of bias is longer than you need, but we'll just trim off the excess or extra when we sew it. So I have this pinned along the curve, and now I'm going to stitch it at a 3/8 inch, basically following in that crease. So starting on one side, back stitching, I'm just stitching in that crease. So now I have this funky little piece that's attached to the curved edge of the garment, and I'm going to press it up away from the garment, making sure that the seam I just sewed is pressed flat. So I'll use the tip of the iron and just kind of pressing that up and away from the bodice piece. But I'm trying not to iron the bias itself because I don't want to disturb that crease that we made when we used the bias binding maker. So now I can fold the bias over the seam edge, and with the pressed edge over here, I'm folding that over the seam edge, and it's just creating this really neat and tidy folded over edge. And the last step we need to do here is we need to stitch this into place so that this folded edge is stitched to the garment. So I am just going to pin this in place, and I want to make sure that the folded edge overlaps the stitch line just a little bit, because I'm going to be stitching this from the top edge, and I'm going to be stitching about 1/8 of an inch to the inside of the binding. So I'll be stitching it from the top, but I want to make sure that that's catching this folded edge. So by pinning it such that it overlaps that stitch line just a little bit, that'll ensure that that line of stitching catches that fold. And one last thing, I'm pinning it from this side because I'm making sure that it's overlapping, but I'm inserting my pins in such that when I do flip it over, they're easy to remove when I'm stitching from the other side. You can see I have this neatly pinned, and I can't see that line of stitching from this side, which is a good sign. That means I'm overlapping it nicely. And then I'll take this to the machine and do the top stitching down that bias edge. So I have this pinned, and then I'm going to take to the machine and stitch about 1/8 of an inch to the inside of the bias binding, catching. I want it to look really even on the front, and I want to catch that folded edge on the back. That's the goal here. So we have this, we're sewing it from the top side, front side. So the underarm side is beautifully finished. You have that nice line of top stitching on the back, and we caught that folded edge on the inside. And now I'm just going to repeat the same process for the other underarm, and then we'll move on to the next piece of bias. So now that we've successfully bound the underarm, we are well equipped for this next step. So I'm going to take the 3 long bias strips that I cut out of the fabric, and first I need to join them together to create one really long strip. So take one of the pieces and place it right side up, and then flip another piece over, and you're going to place it right side down, and you're just going to line up the diagonal edges. And the way I like to do this is I'll slide the top piece over until the notches line up. And this is going to look a little funny because you'll see that the diamond tips of the pieces extend off the edge, but if you pin this into place, the notches sort of help show where the diagonal edge connects the 2 pieces. So you can see here the notches are overlapping and matching, the diagonal edge is lined up, the notches are overlapping on this side. And when we stitch this at that 1/4 inch, that's where the edges line up perfectly. So I'll take this to the machine and stitch down a 1/4 inch. So now I will press this seam open, and I can press it open and flat. And here I have, you can see it's like one long strip, and I can just trim off those little diagonal corners. And then I have this neatly joined together diagonal. So I can do this on the other side and join that 3rd piece to make this one long continuous strip. So I'll just repeat the same process of putting the first piece down right side up, putting the second piece right sides together, and just matching those notches and that diagonal edge. So now I have this one really long continuous piece of bias binding, and I'm going to return to the bias binding maker and run this entire piece through it. So I'll repeat that same process, threading it through the bias binding maker with the tip of the bias, grabbing that, anchoring it to my ironing surface, and then using the iron to follow the bias binding maker and press in those folded edges that the bias binding maker is controlling. So I'm just going to slowly and steadily press out this entire piece so that it makes this nice bias. Now I have this long piece of bias binding, and I'll use it to edge the remaining raw edges of the bodice, but I'm also going to use it to connect the back of the bodice to the front as straps, and then also to create those long wrapping ties. And that's one continuous piece. So I'm going to start in the back, and I'm actually going to clip the excess bias binding from the armhole or underarm area that we edged. So I'll clip that off just so that it follows that continuous line. And so now that's back to that nice clean shape. And then I'm going to start in the back. I'm finding the center back notch, and then I'm going to fold this whole big piece of bias in half. Ooh, there's the middle, and use that to find the middle. So here's my middle, and I will line this up with that back notch. And then this is the exact same process that we followed to edge the underarm area, where you're going to line up the raw edges and pin along the curve, and then stitch in that crease that's about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, 3/8 of an inch from the edge, and then you're going to fold that and pin it and stitch it again. So I'm just going to go through that process here. So that's nicely pinned, and then I'll start by stitching just this section into place. So I'm stitching following the crease, and then I'll fold it back and pin it. So I'm starting my stitch where that bound underarm section intersects with the bias binding I just pinned. the bias attached to the scooping back. And just like before, I'm going to press that up with the tip of my iron. And then I'm folding this edge over and pinning it into place. So this is pinned over, and the pins are poking out away from the garment so that when I do stitch it, I can easily remove that. And now at this stage, you'll notice that the piece extends to the sides, and this is what's going to become the straps. And these are sort of naturally folding in half because of the way that we've stitched and folded and pinned the bias here. So these are going to become the straps, but before I can sew them fully, I really need to determine the length of the strap. This is super important because it's kind of determines the fit of the entire garment and the way that it hangs. So for right now, I'm just going to pin them out about 10 inches to either side of the back, and I'm only going to do that last top stitching step in this back area from 10 inches out to either side of these straps, and then we're going to stop, try it on, and continue the process. So here, instead of folding over the bias and trying to cover that stitch line, because we don't have a stitch line, we're just folding the bias in half. And so we want those two folded edges to line up neatly on top of each other. And now I can take this and I'll bring this to the machine and I'll just start top stitching, about 8-10 inches out. Top stitch around, we're going to be sewing from the top edge, or from the front side. Top stitch around and end out here, and then we'll try it on. So at this point, the back of the bodice is finished and my straps are partially sewn. And these bias strips will come over my shoulder and then attach to the tip of the front of the bodice piece, and then they'll edge this diagonal, and then the straps will continue on and become the wrap ties. We definitely want to get the length of these straps right because it determines how the garment hangs on the body and how it fits. So I'll try this on over a tank top and test that strap length on my own body. So it's a little awkward to try the dress on at this stage because it isn't put together enough to hang on its own. I recommend wearing a tight-fitting tank top that you can pin into. And before you slide it on, I'm just going to super roughly pin the strap over the edge, just so you can, it'll kind of help with the putting it on stage. So I'm just pinning out these straps super roughly, and then I'll slide these on kind of over. It's almost like putting on a vest at this point. And then from here, I can sort of arrange this front. I want this to fall at my waist, and then I want the wrapping front to line up with the side dart, and I want to feel that the side seams are in the right place. So once this is arranged, I'm actually going to pin this into the tank top I'm wearing, and just kind of want to make sure that that is hanging correctly, and then I'll be able to adjust the straps and get the fit right on those. So I have this waist seam at my natural waist, or slightly above. This is like a slight umpire waist. And then this is wrapping nicely around. And then I can start focusing on the straps. So I'll unpin these and kind of grab the strap and pulling it over my shoulder. And because these straps are cut on the bias, they are going to stretch a little bit. So when I'm pinning, I want these to be slightly tighter rather than looser. So I'll pin this side, and then I'll pin this side over. I'll kind of move my shoulders, and that feels pretty good on me. Maybe I'll tighten it a tiny bit. Once you feel like you've gotten the position pinned correctly, you can slip off the dress and just unpin it from the shirt you're wearing underneath, but keep the shoulder pins on. Kind of gingerly slide that off. And then once this is back on your work surface, you can pin those with the strap lengths that you marked. So I've changed back into my teaching uniform, and now that we have the position marked for the strap, I'm going to pin the strap, matching the raw edge of the strap with the raw edge of the bodice front, just like I did in the back. But we're going to start this by marking the position where the strap intersects with the top edge with a pin, just so we don't lose that. And then the one thing to just be a little mindful of is you want to make sure that you're pinning this such that the strap doesn't have a twist. So I'm making sure that that's nice and not twisted, and then I'm showing myself where this will line up when it's folded, and then I'll just unfold it like that. And that process will make sure that we don't have a twist in the strap. It's a little counterintuitive because we're working from it kind of backwards here. So I know that that is where that intersected the top edge, and now I can just pin down this edge, matching these raw edges. Now that I have this first side pinned, I can do the same thing on the other side. And instead of going by where my strap was pinned, I'm actually going to go by exactly where this strap is pinned, because it's important that these are the same length. So I'll match them up in the back and then just sort of follow that strap along, and mirror mark that strap to the length that the first strap I pinned is. And then I now know that this is the same length and will intersect at the same side, or the same length. And then I'll follow that same procedure where I am just making sure that this isn't twisted. And then I will pin down the edge of this, matching the raw edges. So with both sides pinned, I can make that first line of stitching that attaches the bias to the front panel before I fold it over and top stitch it. So I'm just doing this line of stitching where the bias intersects that front piece. And again, following in that crease, that's 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge. So now the straps are secured to the front, just like we did here in the back. And now we're going to do that second line of top stitching. So we're going to do the same process where we fold this over and pin it from the back side, but positioning the pins so that they're easily removed from the top side when we stitch it. So just like I did in the back, I'm pinning this over so that I can't see that line of stitching that I made to connect the bias. And I'm inserting the pins in such a way that I'll be able to easily remove them when I stitch this from the front side. So I have that pinned along the front edge, and I'm also going to pin the folded bias over on the shoulder straps because we're going to continue sewing from where we left off. So I'll pin that over, just fold it in half. And then I'm going to pin in the same way, the folding in half method, this entire wrap strap all the way to the end. So pinning this in half. And because the shoulder strap length is different for everyone, these connection areas where we connected the 3 pieces together, they'll end up on your piece in a different place. So don't worry if yours isn't falling exactly where mine fell here. So I'll pin along the length of this, and then when I get to the end, I'm going to trim this off across the diagonal, just get rid of this little piece, and then I'm going to open that up and fold over about 1/2 inch. Fold that over, and then tuck that seam allowance back in like this, and then I'll fold that in half, and this will create a clean finish at the end of the strap. So I'll just pin that into place. And we'll be able to sew across that very end. So now I have the bias strips pinned all the way around, and I'm going to take this to the machine, and from the side that's facing up, I'm going to stitch starting where I left off on the strap all the way out to the tip of the strap, and I'll go across that edge to finish it, and then I'll start that process again from the other strap and top stitch out to the other end of the tie strap. So your dress is now fully constructed, and we just need to hem the skirt, which means we get to return to our magical hemming tool. So we're going to repeat the exact same process that we used to finish this skirt edge. The only difference is the tool isn't long enough to hem the entire circumference of the skirt all at once, so you can complete this in sections. Now, before we start this, just double check your hem and make sure you don't have any jagged or really frayed edges. And if you do, you can just trim those down. You're not changing the shape of the hem, you're just cleaning it up. Now, I'm going to, with the right side of the skirt hem facing up, find one of those finished edges, and just like we did before, I'm placing my hemming tool, lining up the tooth edge with the raw edge of my skirt, and I'm going to stitch that down along the tooth edge right before it turns into that grid-like structure. I'm going to stitch that the entire length of the tool, and then I'll do that folding process, and we'll do the second line of stitching. Just carefully stitching down, making sure I keep the tool and the edge even, and don't sew into that grid-like structure. So I'm nearing the end of my tool, and I'm just going to sew with the lined up at the edge right to the end of that tool. So now I have the hemming tool stitched to the edge, the raw edge of the skirt hem, all the way to the end of the tool. And I'm going to use the tool to fold the hem over that double fold, and we'll bring that back to the machine and top stitch it, and then slide the tool out and use it for the next section. So I'm pressing it out, folding it over. It looks beautiful. Because I'm stitching this from the back side, I'm actually going to start this top stitch from the end of the section we just finished. So I'll kind of press that out, and I'm just going to, you'll notice that it holds it really cleanly until the tool ends. So I'll just start stitching maybe like a 1/2 inch into the tool to make sure that it's nicely folded. So I'm doing this top stitching about a 1/16 of an inch from the edge, and this edge is just like so tiny and beautiful and even. I'm using the tool to stabilize this, and I'm pulling the underside so that it's making the tightest little fold that's possible around that hemming tool. So as I'm nearing the end here, I'm coming to the intersection of where I have my finished skirt edge and where I'm finishing the hem here. And you just want to make sure that you kind of push this back such that the frayed edge doesn't extend past the finished edge of the skirt. So you'll see that you can just kind of adjust the hemming tool back so that that overlaps nicely. Now as the satisfying part where you get to slide the hemming tool out, and you can see I'm just going to clip all of these threads in here, and this little corner is nicely finished. There's no raw edges that are poking out in this direction. So sliding my hemming tool out all the way along, and occasionally this will bring like a frayed edge out, and that's okay. It's just like dragging that out. You can just trim that off. So if it's pulling that out, no worries. So I'm going to be pulling this out. But it does actually help if you hold the hem as you're pulling it. It won't pull those frayed edges out as much. And now here is where we come to the end of the tool. So just gonna clip the threads here. And then we're just gonna start right here again. And it really, you can't see at all the connection here. So I'm just going to kind of unfold this part and line the hemming tool up with that raw edge and stitch it, and then that will fold this part under to match perfectly with where we left off. So once I do this in sections all the way around the hem, then our entire skirt hem will be finished and the dress will be ready to wear. Thanks so much for sewing with me today. I hope you had fun and learned a few new sewing skills. I brought Amelia back to show off our completed wrap dress project. We love this style for its romantic, swinging, playful feel and the strappy neckline.
We are Amelia and Emily, the co-founders of Wildflower Delivery Co, and we look forward to sewing with you again soon. Please see the link below to check out our other sewing kits on our website and subscribe to our channel to stay in touch. Goodbye for now.